And we are live. This is Austin from Important Call. We are doing our 2-year anniversary panel on the coup in Egypt. I'm joined by Ben Norton, a blogger and activist and musician and general Renaissance lefty, Somia Halawa, who is an Irish citizen and also has strong connections with Egypt. Including her brother, who is. I'm sorry, I'm just getting an echo.
We are doing our 2-year anniversary panel on the 2-year anniversary. I'm joined by Ben Norton.
Okay, there we go. I'm sorry, I had the YouTube link running as well, and I was listening to myself. Then it was a bit strange. Also, Ben Norton, Somia Halawa, who has been a victim of the regime herself, and whose brother is still held in an Egyptian prison. Mohammed al-Masri, who is a professor of communications at Denver University, especially focusing on communications in the Arab world, and Nur Saleh, who is an activist and blogger who's focused on Egypt heavily for the last 2 years since the coup. Thanks everyone for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. What we're talking about, we've chosen today because today is 2 years since the now president, then defense minister of Egypt, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, declared that he had deposed the elected government of Mohamed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood Freedom and Justice Party. And obviously, as we've all been seeing in the news, things are not really going very smoothly for this new government. And 2 years on, there's been an explosion of violence. There's an ISIS franchise very active now in the Sinai Peninsula. There was the killing of up to 13 Muslim Brotherhood members, apparently after they'd been arrested in execution style in downtown Cairo. And we'll come back to that more recent violence later in the discussion, I hope. But just to go back to the beginning of this coup period, there was, from this time 2 years ago, for about a month, there was a very rapid increase in oppression, peaking with the Rabaa massacre, which occurred in August. I'll go to you first of all. Somia, you were in Egypt around this time. If I'm understanding right, you were actually at the Rabaa massacre, or am I getting my wires crossed?
Yeah, I was around that day. We went to Dublin on it was at the end of July, end of June. Then we started to take place in demonstrating in Rabaa. And then we were there. We did witness Rabaa massacre. Me, Fatima, and Ibrahim wasn't there at that time.
Okay, so your brother wasn't actually there during the massive sit-in at Rabaa and the violent crackdown on it, but you were. Do you want to give people a sense of what that was like? Did you, were you shocked by the sort of severity of it, or?
Basically, that day was around 11 o'clock when we decided we want to go home. So what we used to happen is we would stay in Rabaa for almost 2-3 days. There's a place there where we just slept in the mosque sometimes. Sometimes we have friends over there beside Rabaa. Then we would go every 3 days to kind of get our clothes washed and things like this and come back. That day specifically, we started to get ready. It was 11 o'clock. Then we heard people saying, "No, don't leave. It's actually they're attacking the mosque. They're gonna attack the mosque." And we've heard this many times since we've been in Rabaa. So every time you could hear rumors going around saying that they will actually attack. So it was never. It was at this time we didn't know if it was right, it was true, it was false. Then we were asked to remain in our place and don't move. So basically we were in a tent behind the stage. So that's where our Egyptian Umbrella for Democracy's tent was. So we weren't able even to leave the tent at this time, 2 hours, and then we actually started to see the tear gas, the rubber bullets, live bullets, everything. So we started to feel even the mosque was collapsing, little pieces just collapsing, falling from different places. But we weren't really able to see. The scene was not clear for us because, as I said, we were in the tent. We couldn't really see what was happening outside.
Sounds pretty scary to me. Anyhow, I don't like to imagine. And I understand you were taken into custody. Was this at the time, or was this later that you were arrested?
No, there, of course, that day lasted. Then you can say that lasted on from around 3-4 o'clock in the morning until 8 o'clock p.m. the next day. So Fatima was shot by a rubber bullet at that day. It was very hard for people to get in. It was very hard for us to leave. We've witnessed, anything you could imagine in life. So people being shot in the head, people being shot, even people in the hospital. Their friends were begging them to take them they were begging the police officers, the armies, just to kind of try and help them and to take them out of the mosque. And the police officer just shot them, and they said, well, they're no longer alive anymore. Then, because of what happened to Rabaa massacre, there was another protest was held in el-Sisi Square, and that's a demonstration which took place on the 16th of August. That day, by the time we've arrived at el-Sisi, it was I think 5 o'clock p.m. It was hard to say. It was actually a huge protest, but people started to separate because there was as again, same as what happened in the Rabaa massacre. There's police officers, armies, thugs, and randomly killing people, children. So we just decided we're just gonna head home because it's not just safe. As we were leaving, the army started to surround el-Sisi Square, and no longer we were able to leave the place itself. So we just said. Then it was very, very close to the curfew time, so you were not allowed anyway to leave. If you were caught at this time, they actually have the right to do so and arrest you if you were caught at the curfew time. So then we just headed to the mosque, thinking it was the safest place at that time. And there was actually live. There was a few channels. There was Al Jazeera live at this time. There was Al Hawar as well. And I think this is where at one stage felt we're a bit safe because the world can see us. No one can see. They actually can't do anything to us. But once the connection was lost, there were no longer. There was no live anymore. They actually attacked the mosque, and this was around 12 o'clock p.m. the next day.
Okay, and so this is again still before you were actually taken into custody, because my understanding from our social media producer Johnny is that you and your sisters, also we should just mention for our audience, Somia mentioned her sister Fatima. That was one of their whole family, basically all 4 siblings, 3 sisters and 1 brother were in custody for a period, is my understanding. Is that correct?
Yes, that's true. So 4 of us were in the mosque. So me, Fatima, Umayma, and Ibrahim. At 12 o'clock, they started to throw tear gas inside the mosque and live bullets, rubber bullets. We were trying to hide as much as we can, but from the tear gas, I fainted, and Umayma fainted. So we got separated at this time. I got separated from my siblings. When I woke up, I was with 33 girls and few boys. I asked the armies, where is everyone else? He said, everyone's gone home, and I can take you home as well. I just didn't feel safe. I said, no, I will stay with these people. It was around 3-4 o'clock p.m. when we had to leave the mosque. Only Egyptian media were allowed inside the mosque. They weren't allowed any other medias at this time. We were taken from inside to the outside. That was another story. So armies were trying to take off your clothes, and they were just pulling you from everywhere, from your body. The men who were protesting with us, who were with us in the mosque, those are the people who are trying to save us. So it's not the police officers, it's not the armies. Then we were shown inside a van which doesn't fit 10 people. We were around 40 at this time. People started to faint. Some people, we had a man who died inside because there were some people had a problem with their heart. It was really, really stuffy, and there's hardly oxygen inside. By the time we arrived, we arrived to a place called Tura military camps, and there where I found my other siblings. I found Fatima, Umayma, and Ibrahim. Ibrahim had his hand wrapped as he was bleeding at this time, I asked him what happened. He said, while I was leaving the mosque, I got shot from the armies or the police officers. Of course, he was denied medical treatment until this day. Then we were taken to Salam military camps. Actually, this day it was until this day I don't know the answer to this. We were almost 33 girls. The 30 girls was left to leave to go home at this day, and we were the only people. We were the only 3 girls who stayed, and you know, we were taken. We were arrested. So the other 30 girls, they only investigated with them, and then they let them go at the same day, but we didn't leave at that day. So we had a Turkish journalist, his name is Metin, but he was released 2 months after us. So then we were taken to a place called the Salam military campus. Salam is kind of you can say an underground place. We were put in with another.
So a subterranean prison, physically under the ground, you mean?
Yeah, it is. It is. And the military camps, the Tura military camps, was also it's not prison where people are military. So it's actually an inhumane place. Like humans can't. We couldn't stand it for 1 day. I don't know how we managed to stay there 4 days. We were denied food. We were denied toilets, even our basic human rights. Our family came over to try and to ask if we were there. They said we don't exist in that place. It's 3 days later when my family knew where we were actually. Then from a Salam military.
So I'm sorry, the 3 girls were released after 3 days, were you saying, or?
The 30 girls. So we were 33 girls there, taken from inside the mosque. There were we were the only 3 girls, 3 sisters were left behind.
Okay, you were kept, and how long were you kept? I mean, were you kept for a period of months or weeks or just a few days?
Yes, so then we were taken to Al-Marq prison, Al-Qanatir prison, ladies prison. We were left there for 3 months.
3 months.
Yeah.
And when you got out, was that because, I mean, you're all Irish citizens as well. When you got out, was that because of any intervention from the Irish government, or did it just seem to be another arbitrary decision by the military?
Sorry, when we were released? Sorry, I can't hear you properly.
When you were released, was there any sign of involvement from the Irish government on your behalf as Irish citizens, or did it just seem to be something that the military decided on their own?
I hope this was the answer, but it's not, because when we were inside, we actually we were treated as we were treated as an Irish and Egyptian citizen, so we weren't really treated as a proper pure Egyptian citizen. So every time we said we have a right to this, they say no, you're not an originally Irish. With this problem we're still facing until that day with Ibrahim. No, we were just released all of a sudden. Every time we go to a so-called hearing, we were mute 45 days. The day we were actually released, we were just called for a hearing, and no reason, we were just released. And we don't know the reason why we were released and Ibrahim still remains behind bars. And
yes, since then, of course, your brother Ibrahim Halawa has been held for 2 years, nearly exactly, right? Yes. And there's been a real surprising sort of lack of attention from it in the Irish public sphere, in politics, the media. It's because there have been cases of foreign citizens who have been released upon renunciation of their Egyptian passports. There was an American citizen, American Egyptian dual citizen, who was released on that basis. Do you have do you have any sort of contact with the Irish authorities? Do you feel like there's any support for you? Is there much of a support for group for your network, rather, for your family in Ireland, or?
Basically, when I was released, it was all of a sudden I had to start a campaign which I have no clue how to do it. So I started by the Irish government, obviously, because this is where I need to start. But then 6 months later, I felt I'm not getting a proper response. I'm not getting a proper support. The answer I'm getting, we can't intervene in a judicial process. Even though at one stage in Geneva they said they don't believe there is a judicial process, so they're contradicting themselves. The answer there at one stage I felt, okay, are they actually supporting what's happening in Egypt? They're actually not going. They've never came out in the media and say we're concerned about this mass trial, because Ibrahim is along with 494 others. So which means that this is the longest case since the coup took place. Al-Fatih case. They've never had a proper trial. Every time something happens, they postponed it, or they delay it, or the judge decides to leave. The Irish government never came out concerning about what's happening in Egypt, annoyed or defending Ibrahim. And so every time there's a hearing or there is something happens, they say, well, this is up to the judge and this is up to the system in Egypt, and this is we can't intervene. And it's actually becoming to a stage. We've been in Ireland. I wasn't born in Ireland. I was born in Egypt. So Ibrahim he's born and raised in Ireland. So when I come and say to myself, maybe when I was in prison, that's the way they needed to deal with me, because I'm not originally Irish. But why are they still doing this with Ibrahim? Do they sometimes I just had to question my questions and have those questions in my mind, and the answer to it I actually don't have it until this day. Do they actually believe Ibrahim is innocent, or do they actually believe Ibrahim is not innocent? Is
it possible? I might suggest that they don't care. Is also a factor to consider. I had a brief altercation with the Egyptian judicial system when I was in Egypt. A woman I'm now married to and two others as well were all charged. And I had a similar kind of deal from the Australian, when I was dealing with the Australian consular service, that, oh no, we have to respect the independence of Egypt's judiciary, which is of course a bit like respecting, the fairness of Santa Claus. It's not a thing. There is no independence of the judiciary then, and there isn't now. I think actually, if I can, I'll get Mohammed al-Masri to jump in at this stage, because there's two things I really wanted. I thought you could pick up on, which is firstly these mass trials, which Ibrahim has been one of the subjects of, and secondly the discourse on the sort of the role of the judiciary in Egypt, which has been key. In fact, for the propaganda of the coup to get started, depended on this idea that Morsi was becoming a dictator by trying to circumvent this very same judiciary. So perhaps you could give us an idea of the scale and frequency of these mass trials and how quickly they go and so forth, and just comment a bit more on the role of the judiciary in this whole political dynamic of Egypt.
Sure. First of all, I just wanted to correct you. I'm no longer at the University of Denver. I'm at the University of North Alabama. In terms of, and if I could just piggyback on something that Fatima was saying, at Rabaa, I encourage everyone to read the human rights report that was produced by Human Rights Watch. It's called All According to Plan. It was released about 1 year after the Rabaa massacre, and it's a pretty comprehensive detailing, an account of what actually happened. And they say that the military was, the police were the ones actually doing the shooting, but they went in with the intention of killing a large number of people. They were shooting to kill. They have primary evidence that they were shooting to kill, including evidence of people that were clearly unarmed and actually carrying dead bodies on their shoulders. Those people were shot at point blank range. And not only that, but I have a friend whose brother was shot to death, shot in the head and killed at Rabaa. And when he went and he's an American Egyptian, my friend is, and when he went to get the body, they gave him a death certificate that said that he had died of natural causes, that his brother had died of natural causes. And he said at the health ministry office that there were hundreds of people that just accepted those death certificates. The government was doing that to try and deflate, systematically deflate the casualty figures. My friend did not accept that. He's an American Egyptian. He's very keen on justice and human rights. So he actually traveled all around Cairo to try to get a proper death certificate. He was threatened with death. They said that they were going to kill him. They also said that they would burn the body. But he was undaunted by that, and ultimately he got a proper death certificate saying that his brother was shot to death. And only then, about 24 hours after this whole ordeal started, was he able to get the body and then bury his brother. In terms of the judiciary is part of Egypt's deep state. There are 4 big institutions that have been really running Egypt in different ways for decades: the military, the police, the media apparatus, and then also the judiciary. During that Morsi period, and actually even before Morsi, after Mubarak, the dictator, was ousted, the judiciary was playing an obstructionist role. They had disbanded the democratically elected parliament. They disbanded the Constitutional Assembly, the first one. Then they threatened to disband the second assembly. They threatened to rescind a very important decree that Mohamed Morsi had delivered almost as soon as he was elected, that effectively removed the military from politics. They're very corrupt. These are judges. The senior judges were appointed by Mubarak himself, and Mubarak was very keen on making sure that these judges stayed in place. So one of the things that he did was he systematically increased the age limit for judges. He increased it from 60 to 65, and then he increased it from 65 to 70, so he could keep this loyal group of veteran judges. And those are the same people that were obstructing Egypt's democratic moves forward. After the coup, it's been more of the same, but the judiciary's actions have been intensified. And you mentioned, Austin, these mass trials and these mass death sentences, which have been condemned by all of the human rights groups that have covered them. Just to give you one example, the very first mass death sentence was issued back in the spring of 2014. This was a trial that lasted, or I should say the sentence came after a trial that lasted a total of about 3 hours. And there were more than 500 defendants. They were not allowed to present any sort of defense, and they were all convicted of killing a single police officer. So more than 500 men convicted for killing one police officer. Some of those who were convicted were already dead. Some of those at the time of the crime. Some of those convicted had already been in jail at the time the alleged crime was committed. So it was a completely absurd set of circumstances, and these men were all sentenced, of course, sentenced to death. There were 3 subsequent mass death sentences, so we have a total of 4 now. So I think I'd have to look at the numbers, but it's something like 1,500 people that have been sentenced to death in these mass trials that are very short and where they're not even allowed to present any sort of defense for themselves. So, yeah, the judiciary is sort of just, it's in the back pocket of the executive, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. We have some evidence that there's not as though we need it, but we have evidence of interference in the judiciary by the executive, tampering with court cases. So it's all part of Egypt's campaign to eliminate all opposition. You have to read the actions of the judiciary in the context of what's happening in Egypt. The most important opposition, including the largest and most organized party in Egypt, has been eliminated. All of the opposition television networks have been shut down. We've had more than 40,000 people arrested. We've had mass killings in the streets, the largest massacres of protesters in modern world history. It's all a part of eliminating the opposition, most notably the Muslim Brotherhood, who won 5 straight democratic elections after the coup. I'm sorry, after the ousting of Mubarak. But also any other opposition, like the April 6th movement, and liberal secular opponents of the regime as well. So the judiciary is part of that. They're doing the bidding of the executive.
You mentioned the media there briefly. I'd like if you can just to sort of revisit the issue of the media. So Maya was talking about that there were still sympathetic channels broadcasting during those frenzic sort of frantic days around the time of the coup when she was arrested and so forth. But and then once that they were cut off, you saw the military sort of unleashed and showing even less restraint than it had been showing. What's interesting to me is, well, of course, when you present this evidence to a lot of people in the sort of Anglophone world, they say, oh, well, the Muslim Brotherhood was doing that anyhow. The Muslim Brotherhood was clamping down on free speech anyhow, and there were some cases brought against critics of the President Mohamed Morsi as for insulting the president and under these various laws during his tenure. But can you try and, as a professor of media studies, can you try and give us a clearer picture of what was the media situation like under the Muslim Brotherhood, and then how did that change? Just talking about the sort of the domestic media, and then we'll broaden up the conversation in a minute and bring Ben and Noor in, and we'll talk about the international media as well.
Sure. Well, it's a complex picture, but during that Morsi period, during the 1 year in which Morsi was president, there was a very vibrant media environment. Press freedoms were at an all-time high for Egypt. One of the issues, there were a couple of issues. One was that the independent media, the privately owned media, went on a very aggressive campaign to demonize Mohamed Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood. They abandoned all norms of professionalism, and I dare say that much of what they were saying on their broadcasts would not have been allowed, legally allowed, even in some Western countries, where there are some reasonable restrictions on what the press can and cannot say. Just to give you an example, I mean, they were going on television claiming in serious news reports that Mohamed Morsi had a plan in place and actually had a contract in place to sell the pyramids, the Great Pyramids of Giza. There were reports that Morsi was going to sell the Suez Canal. There were reports that Morsi was going to give away the entire Sinai Peninsula to...
There were maps that circulated, I remember, maps showing the whole sections of Egypt that were going to be sold off to foreign powers. Yeah. Of course, it's hilarious because the people who are saying this are largely pushing the agenda of a military that is, in the pocket, literally on the payroll of foreign powers to the tune of billions of dollars.
Yeah, and I just want to emphasize, this is not like The Onion or something. These are serious news reports in major daily newspapers, and then most importantly, on all of the late night news talk shows. Egypt is a news talk show culture. 40% of the people are illiterate, and so you have these huge talking heads, sort of the Bill O'Reillys of Egypt, and there are many of them, and they have millions and millions of viewers, and they were going on TV spouting this nonsense, and many people were believing it, including people I'm kind of ashamed to admit, but at my old university, the American University in Cairo, I mean, I came across academics who believed these things quite firmly. There was...
I think it's worth stopping for a second and pointing out the important... The alumni of the American University in Cairo have a very special role, I think, in sort of like students, professors, the community around that university have a very special role in interfacing with the West. When Noam Chomsky came to speak in Egypt, he spoke in the AUC hall. They have a sort of privileged position. It was interesting because, you have the front row of the hall is reserved for people like Amr Moussa and people who, Chomsky has been a vociferous critic of for decades. but they were still having the privileged position of front row seats at his talk because it was held at this, essentially an imperial institution. What is an American university in, which is a foreign culture university, which is also where the elite, or many of the elite of Egypt and Cairo go. So there was a lot of people from leftist groups, the revolutionary socialists, who a lot of global leftists were looking to for analysis and understanding of the situation, also center around the American University in Cairo. It's this interesting place where you've got some great academic quality, but also the bias of privilege, which it's a very privileged institution. Anyhow, I'm sorry to interrupt. Please go on.
And some of the scholars at AUC did a really nice job of covering what was happening, and some others didn't, in my estimation. But speaking of the AUC, and just on this point about the media's role in all of this, I did a study a couple of years ago, and my research team and I, we went out and interviewed journalists in Egypt. And one of the things that we found is that journalists at these private newspapers were very proud of the fact that they were intentionally biasing news reports against Mohammed Morsi. They thought that this was part of their nationalistic duty, whereas in the United States or in Ireland or in Australia, we would privilege objectivity and fairness and balance. They thought it was their national duty to try and demonize Morsi and the Brotherhood, and they actually showed us, they gave us examples of how they and their editors would sort of bend over backwards to demonize the Brotherhood in these very misleading reports. So that was the environment, and in that context, Mohammed Morsi did file charges. I believe there were 3 cases that the presidency filed against journalists. And I don't necessarily agree with Morsi for doing that, but I think it's important to place that within the larger context. Now, after the coup, things have become much more hysterical. All of the opposition media has been shut down, as I mentioned, and so you have only one voice. It's a hysterical, hyper-nationalist, pro-military voice. They're demonizing the Brotherhood as devils and cockroaches. They're justifying the mass repression. Just to give you one example, and I don't want to go on too long, but we're talking about the Rabaa massacre on August 14th, 2013. On that day, or in the day, I think it was the day after, one of the private networks called On TV, which is a very popular network viewed by millions of people, they were airing footage of the dispersal of Rabaa, and they had this. First they had like this pro-military music, and then they went into showing this very heroic footage of the military, and then they started playing the music for the movie Rocky. If you're familiar with that music, right? Da, 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 right? They're actually playing the Rocky music, and at that point, one of my American students actually emailed me, and he said, I don't even have words for what I'm describing. He said, I'm watching On TV, and they're playing the music for Rocky, showing these people dispersing a protest. Obviously, they're not showing the gunshots. They're showing the military, clean up the rubble and so on and so forth. But this was a massacre of at least 800 people, probably much more. Those are just the numbers that Human Rights Watch was able to confirm. And they're being portrayed as heroes. The media figures came out and thanked them. They said, you are our heroes. You've defeated the treasonous Muslim Brotherhood. And so this was actually something, while it was being condemned everywhere in the world, in the sane part of the world, it was actually being celebrated in Egypt through these media networks.
That's a great example of how really sort of blatant and bloodthirsty a lot of the media coverage in Egypt was. What I was hoping to do now is, what was amazing to me is seeing some of this coverage, seeing the local coverage and how blatantly anti-democratic it was. For months there were headlines in Egypt in major dailies calling for a military coup, and then in that context you had left-wing commentators and sort of commentators who are normally seen as pro, national sovereignty and anti-foreign interference and pro-democracy and so forth, still taking the side of anti-Morsi protesters. And I'm what's interesting to me is how did that happen? I'd really like maybe Ben and Noor could jump in at this point. Noor and Ben, could you guys unmute your microphones? I'm sorry to have kept you guys out of the conversation so long. I'm really curious. Maybe Noor, you go first. You were working with sort of Palestine activism and so forth at the time. About what was it that made you realize, that there was this? How do you think it happened? How do you think it happened that the left got so spun when there was such sort of blatant demonstration of what was actually going on in Egypt?
I think Muhammad's point was very accurate. You had it was a very gradual process. If we remember 2 years ago, the liberals that were supporting the coup, their reasons for it were, we need to prevent a civil war. This is good. Look at what's happening in Sinai. Things are a disaster. This is for the best of Egypt. They had a lot of justification for it, and all these reasons, the narrative quickly shifted from we're averting a civil war to suddenly actually Sisi's coming out saying give me a mandate, let's go fight them, to these are terrorists, to actually calling them sheep, to just plain out celebrating their murder. I had Egyptian friends seeing them on my timeline the day of the massacre. So I'm watching the live footage. I was watching it from one of the channels, seeing people being killed in front of my eyes, and then going on Twitter and seeing friends celebrating, rejoicing that these sheep are being massacred. So you actually have this gradual process, but it starts off just one slight respect of, we're doing it so that we don't have a civil war. We're doing it because they weren't so inclusive. We're doing it because it's an incompetent government. It started out really mellow-toned, and then it just sort of snowballed into a constant demonization, where it's reached a point that at the end of the day, we don't care. We don't care. Anything can happen to you. It doesn't matter, because we're going to throw on a label of Islamist, and which is quite shocking, because if you remove all these labels, if you take away secular or liberal or revolutionary, Islamist, Salafi, whatever, once you leave them, it was actually the Islamists that were going out saying, where is my vote? I went through not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, but 5 elections. I voted again and again and again. And you're telling me at the end of the day, I'm sorry, your vote doesn't count? You told me the importance of democracy, the importance of working within a system to change, to embrace change. And when they did work within the system, it wasn't good enough. It was actually, it's not all about the ballot box. It's about,
I remember that it's not all about, there's more to democracy than voting, to which I used to say,
exactly.
Yeah, and there's more to soccer than kicking the ball, but it's kind of important. Ben, I'll get you to jump in if you can. I know we've kept you waiting a long time. I mean, how do you think that, because normally when Mohammed was describing the press situation where you have this fiercely aggressive corporate press and an administration that pushes back through libel cases or other sort of judicial means, and then that gets described as, dictatorial control of the press. We see that all the time in the coverage of Venezuela, Latin America, these places where, but then at least they've got the Western left on their side because they're socialist governments, and we're going to take a sympathetic view. Obviously, the social conservatism of the Muslim Brotherhood alienated a lot of the Western left. But is that all that happened, or was it more? I mean, I think personally that there was a degree of misrepresentation by important sort of interlocutors in Egypt of what was going on. What's your take? How did we get it so wrong?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that you had said and everything that others had said. I think actually Noor raised a really interesting point about a kind of knee-jerk fear of any movements that are Islamist. And I think and this is equally present on the Western left, and I think when you look at the reactions to the Muslim Brotherhood, I mean, aside from critiques of social conservatism and such, and a side of critiques of presenting Morsi as a neoliberal, and I can maybe address that in a second. I think that's an interesting point. But I do think there is this idea that the Muslim Brotherhood were not genuine revolutionaries, and I think even if you look at different documentary coverage and different films, like Muslim Brotherhood presented a group co-opted the revolution, right? Even though it has this enormous mass support among the Egypt population.
I'm sorry, Ben. Do you think you could kill your camera and say that again, because the words got a bit chewed up and came out like a bit robot-y? Is that okay?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
I can hear you better now. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so I think so there are a few different approaches here, but I think what's interesting is, like I said, there's this kind of knee-jerk opposition to any movements that are Islamist. And I think what's interesting is if you look at the representation of the revolution, going back to 2011, in documentaries and even very progressive media, there's this impression that a lot of people promote that the Muslim Brotherhood somehow co-opted the revolution, which is of course ridiculous considering the Muslim Brotherhood has by far the largest mass base of support, particularly among the Egyptian working class and things like that. And I think what's interesting is you look at these people who say the Muslim Brotherhood is genuinely not this revolutionary organization, blah, blah, blah.
They don't have any Che patches sewn onto their clothing or bags.
Exactly. Exactly. And Nora raised a good point. I mean, the people who were saying, we want to vote, we want these democratic rights, etc., were largely, members of the Muslim Brotherhood. And I think if you know anything about popular movements today in the Middle East, you understand that the most revolutionary organizations, particularly among the youth, are Islamist. And a lot of leftists in the West, and even just like liberals and secularists, are stuck in this impression back in the 60s and 70s with Nasserist movements and Ba'athist movements and things like that. So they have this impression that the so-called real revolutionaries are secularists, etc., etc., and they essentially just echo all these Orientalist and even Islamophobic myths in response to that. So I mean, you look at many of the critiques of Morsi, and you can see the kind of thing. Oh, he's trying to impose Sharia and things like that on people, which is hilarious because then you look at more religious conservatives in Egypt who criticize Morsi for being what they saw as too secular and things like that. So,
a recent article by Muhammad pointed out very succinctly that there was actually a debate specifically over this, whether Egypt would change the constitutional clause relating to Sharia from what it's been for ages, which is that it is based on the principle that law is based on the principles of Sharia, to a more concrete, no, law is based in Sharia, and Morsi was on the side of keeping it in the more open and loose interpretation, which wouldn't tie down governments to a strict fundamentalist reading. And I've often said, actually, to some extent, the Muslim Brotherhood were the sort of liberal, middle-class section of Egyptian society, which they're always presented as the threat to. But please go on.
Yeah, well, I think you raised a good point there. What's funny is, the interpretation in the Constitution that Morsi advocated was a Sadat-era interpretation. This is not something that the Muslim Brotherhood itself created. I mean, this is something that has precedence since the 1980s and things like that. So, I mean, there is a lot of hypocrisy, and I think a lot of it, frankly, comes down to ignorance, frankly, of the subtleties of politics, not just in Egypt, but in general, the Middle East and North Africa. And I think, frankly, I mean, the left tends to be much more educated on political issues, but at the same time, a lot of the left, when it comes to Islamist movements and things like this, they just learn a few talking points, and then they just recite the talking points ad nauseum over and over again. So, like, for instance, one that you heard a lot, and there are critiques to be made of this, but at the same time, we have to understand the context. There's the point that, okay, Morsi was trying to take a $4 billion loan from the IMF and things like that. And what people would do is they would just learn these few talking points and recite them. And I have some
neoliberal.
Sorry?
Therefore, he's neoliberal.
Oh,
I mean,
exactly.
Actually, yeah. There was talk of loans for Ecuador with the IMF, one of the this so-called socialism for the 21st century countries of Latin America, similarly used to then, by some critics, to discredit, the Korea here as a neoliberal and try and cut him off from that support base in the West. That doesn't have nearly as much success as it does when they're doing it with Islamist groups, though.
Oh, exactly. And actually, it's funny that you raise that point, because this is something I've discussed with a lot of people in the past few years. But I find I mentioned like the knee-jerk Islamophobia essentially really ironic when you consider how enthusiastically the same Western leftists support liberation theology movements in Latin America. Because we see very comparable movements in the Middle East and North Africa in different Islamist movements. We see this kind of very politically engaged liberation theology that is rooted in Islam rather than Christianity. But then these Western leftists who know nothing about Islam, and even though they might criticize Islamophobia, in the back of their heads they still see it as this reactionary religion. When they see a similar movement in the Middle East, they're not willing to support it. And part of that perhaps is because in a lot of liberation theology movements in Latin America, they're overtly leftist. But again, there's this lack of understanding that, as you said, I mean, the revolutionary socialists are a very privileged group. Gigi Ibrahim and others that like speak very good English and have a web presence, and they can market the
Orange County.
Yeah, and they can market the revolution to the West, to people who speak English and are secular and all these things. Whereas, as was mentioned earlier, I mean, with the incredible poverty and illiteracy widespread among, impoverished parts of Egypt, they can't just get on the internet and talk in English and, make friends with Western leftists so they can support them, whatever that even means anyway. I think it's actually greatly exaggerated, particularly among leftists. The import they actually have in the world.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest sort of deceptions is the importance of secular left-wing Western-looking groups in Egyptian politics. They sort of make out as if they would, as a reporter who was in Egypt, I would constantly be told, Egypt really has a secular heart. Before the elections happened, if you were around before the first voting started happening, if you were around Tahrir Square and that the sort of scene associated with that, you'd constantly be hearing that, oh, don't worry, the Brotherhood won't win any elections, right? And it's sort of they created this myth of their own importance, which then helped them create the idea that there's that they are this sort of vital revolutionary, the true bearers of the torch, so to speak, and they're being suppressed by the opportunistic Brotherhood. When, of course, the Brotherhood suffered through repression for decades. And I wanted to quickly link this up with what the mainstream media as well, because normally what was amazing to me is recently I was looking for articles from the time, and just in the Google results, there were 5 or 6 headlines of Egypt's second revolution. One was Financial Times, one was Marxist.com. So you had this sort of unity of the Western commentariat from left to right in supporting this second revolutionary moment, which in hindsight is clearly counter-revolutionary. And I think part of the reason for that goes right back to the beginning of the revolution, to before that rather, this decades of anti-Islamist and anti-Islam propaganda, you could say centuries even in the West, but in the case of the Egyptian sort of Twitterati, it was amazing to me how much the secular voices that had absorbed what was essentially the regime propaganda against the Brotherhood, the demonization, how deeply that shaped their view, and the mirror of that in the West, how deeply, as you mentioned, suspicious of Islam so many even progressive people in the West are. One thing I just on this point I want to hammer it home. I remember as the revolution was first taking off, the Australian newspaper, the biggest daily newspaper in Australia, published an editorial where it slammed the Brotherhood for their reactionary ways. And what they did, they dug up a quote. They went back to, I think it was Sayyid Qutb, or it may have been Hassan al-Banna. I'm sorry, I don't have the quote in front of me, but a quote denouncing jazz music as the degenerate music of the Negro. And this was a quote from the sort of the 20s or some or 30s or some period like that. And there was no sense of self-consciousness of what the Australian newspaper itself was saying at that time. At that time, the Australian newspaper or the equivalent Australian press would have been, enthusiastically endorsing this the White Australia policy and sort of overtly publishing, the Chinese opium menace, blah blah blah. So you've got this sense that they go back decades to find something reactionary and racist sounding that the Brotherhood have said, and then from that context, you had the drum beating immediately. As soon as the revolution was happening, you had the drum beating for this fear the Islamists are coming, they're going to take over and it's going to be disastrous, we're better off going back to a military dictatorship which can contain these crazy people. And then what happened was, around 2 years ago, you had the leftists and progressives who would never openly say these things, basically come up with their own version of it, basically come up with their own more subtle, and to use the term dog whistling, I don't think is inappropriate, their own more understated narrative, but which still relied on these essentially racist and propagandized ideas about Islamists and Islam.
Yeah, I mean, I agree entirely. I think especially the point that you hit on the head is how perhaps unwittingly Western leftists who consider themselves so revolutionary and progressive ended up just echoing not just Egyptian regime propaganda, but even Western corporate media propaganda. And I think another interesting thing that I remember hearing as proof, for instance, that as you had mentioned, supposedly Egypt has this wide secular base, and actually the Muslim Brotherhood is encroaching on that. And people said, Hamdim Sabahi got 20% of the vote in the first election, and Morsi got 25%. Blah blah blah. So actually, there's going to be this Nasserist revolution, and et cetera, without understanding any of the nuances of Egyptian history and all these different things. So it's just funny to see I mean, as you had mentioned, there's no nuance in the understanding of the role, even looking back at Nasser and things like that. There's no nuance of understanding of the role of Islamic politics or Islamist politics rather within these movements, because Nasser wasn't in the Western sense was not a secular leader in these kinds of things, and there's just this sorry.
I think that's very interesting. The role of Nasser and the sort of the way the left idealized Nasser and Nasserism.
Absolutely.
Is important. I also think it'd be great. I want to open up so everyone can kind of jump in again a bit now, especially. Mohammed, you've done a great deal of discussing about how the current regime is not at all secular either. I want everyone unmute your mics now. I want people to sort of just be a bit more freeform here. Sorry not to cut Ben off, but I just want to sort of get things a bit more loose before the end here. Mohammed, you've written extensively about Ali Guma and other sort of figures who are sort of fatwa on demand religious scholars for the regime. And as Ben just mentioned, that goes right back that there was religious elements of these supposedly secular military regimes for since the very beginning.
Right. So I think it's important for people to understand that while there are some secularists in Egypt and there are some atheists or agnostics, overwhelmingly Egypt is a very religious society. The Christians in Egypt are very religious, by and large, and the Muslims in Egypt are very religious. So any leader, whether it was Mubarak or Nasser or Sadat or Sisi, has to project himself as a pious man. And Sisi has actually been very aggressive. If you look at his speeches, he's been very aggressive in terms of his discussions about Islam, his discussions about God, his notion that he's pleasing God or seeking to please God.
He said God sent him as a doctor to cure Egypt.
Right. That's a great point, Ben. He
had a dream with a glowing Omega watch, which showed him the future or something like that as well. These are public statements this guy makes.
Yeah, public statements. I mean, most recently, as Ben just pointed out, he said that God sent him as a doctor to cure Egypt of its ails. But in this context, they have trotted out all of the what we would call in Arabic the ulama as-sultan, the scholars of the sultan, the religious scholars who support the regime. They've trotted them out, and one by one, they've offered up undying support for Sisi. One guy, just to give you an example, an Azharite scholar from Al-Azhar University, he praised Sisi as a messenger of God. He called him a messenger of God. Another scholar wrote a poem, a very glowing poem about Sisi. I've mentioned Ali Guma, who's the former Grand Mufti, who supported Sisi in his election bid, who has justified the repressive policies. Just last month, I should say in May, 6 young men were executed wrongly. They were hanged, even though Human Rights Watch, Human Rights Monitor, and Amnesty International say that the young men could not possibly have committed the crime that they were accused of because they were already in jail at the time the crime was committed, according to Egyptian court records. Well, Ali Guma, they trotted him out on national television, and he justified the executions and said that the government was right to execute them, and he condemned the 6 young men as, quote, dogs of the hellfire, kilabun nar, dogs of the hellfire. So this is the kind of religious rhetoric that we're seeing. Recently, a religious preacher who's sympathetic to Sisi gave a Friday sermon, and Friday is kind of the, sort of the holy day, if you will, for Muslims, where they go to the mosque and listen to a sermon. There are large gatherings, and he recounted a story. And the story was, it was a true story according to this sheikh, and he said that a man who disliked Sisi went to Mecca to perform the small pilgrimage, the Umrah, which is a religious ritual in Islam. And he went there with the intention of praying against Sisi, of making a supplication against him. And he said he tried for several days and his tongue became paralyzed. He could not utter Sisi's words in a negative way. And the man came back and said he promises, he vows before God to only support Sisi going forward. And this was the subject of a Friday sermon given by one of the scholars who's sympathetic to Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. It's not just the Muslims. The Christian scholars have also been very supportive of the Sisi government. It's very important to point that out, that the church has been very supportive of Sisi as well, including the Pope himself, who just, by the way, donated last month. He donated £1 million to Sisi's Suez Canal project, and a lot of people were, sort of up in arms. People that are more truly revolutionary, saying, well, you have all these starving people, and you're donating £1 million to Sisi's failed project in the Suez Canal, and also, not to mention the fact of where did you get all this money? Where did the Pope get £1 million? Apparently, money of church votes.
For complete Egypt noobs watching at home, this is the Coptic Pope we're talking about. Obviously, not the Catholic Pope.
Right.
Just for but I mean, the one thing that people who take a very hostile.
If I could just say one more thing real quickly, the Pope also sent out a tweet on the day of the Rabaa massacre. The Coptic Pope. He sent out a tweet thanking the Egyptian police and military for the heroic job that they did. He was attacked savagely in the Twitter world, as he should have been, and then he promptly deleted the tweet the next day. Are we still there?
I'm here.
Austin, you there? Did we lose Austin?
I think we lost him. But yeah, definitely. And it seems really ironic that the fears that seculars and liberals had are very much in place now under the military regime that they actually endorsed. So you still hear the arrest of gays is happening, the violations being committed against, Muslims and Christians alike. There are still churches being attacked. There are still mosques being attacked. People are being attacked now for the way they dress. so the fears, what June 30th set out to accomplish, the argument for it, one of them was that actually we don't want to live in such a society where this becomes the norm, and it wasn't the norm so much as it is now. Now, if anything, the sectarian rhetoric has been upped.
I agree, and yeah, I mean, Egypt is not a secular society. No matter no matter how much some people might will or wish for it to be, it's not. And I think it's very telling that after Morsi was ousted, they wrote a new constitution, and they kept the religious article in it, the Article 2 that says that Islamic Sharia is the foundation, or the principles of Islamic Sharia are the foundations of the legal system. That article remained in Sisi's constitution. It wasn't removed. And actually, it's interesting because under that 2012 constitution, if we want to talk about religion, the 2012 constitution that was passed when Morsi was president, there were the liberals in the assembly, in the Constitutional Assembly, made a couple of requests. The first was they wanted an article saying that Al-Azhar University, which is seen as this, moderate Islam, they wanted an article that said that Al-Azhar University would be responsible for interpreting Sharia in legislative matters that involved Sharia. And all of the Islamists in the assembly agreed to that article. Later, people that were ignorant of the constitution building process pointed at that article somehow, inexplicably, as evidence that the Muslim Brotherhood was trying to further, Islamicize Egypt, right? And this was a liberal suggestion. There was another article that the that non-Islamists, specifically Christians, requested in 2012, and it was either Article 3 or Article 4, but it basically exempted Christians and Jews from Sharia. And all of the Islamists on the assembly, and I actually spoke to a liberal member of the assembly. I did an extensive interview with him, and he said all of the Islamists on the assembly, or in the assembly, agreed to it. Not only did they agree to the article, but even after the Christian members withdrew from the assembly, no one suggested that the article be removed, and it was kept in the Constitution word for word, as the Christian representatives had suggested. So I think this idea that Egypt was, quote, becoming another Iran, or, quote, becoming another Saudi Arabia, these were just greatly exaggerated fears that weren't really grounded in any substantive analysis. I'm not saying that people had no right to feel any apprehensiveness. I mean, if you're a totally secular person, I can understand how you might feel a little bit apprehensive about living in Egypt, where the Sharia is a very important part of the life. I can understand that. I can get with that. But the point is, if you're gonna feel that way about Egypt in 2012 and 2013, you should also feel that way now, because for practical purposes, Egypt is still a deeply religious society. And it looks like we've just lost Austin. And does anybody else have anything to say? Otherwise, we might want to just close off the conversation. We've been on for an hour anyways. People might be getting sick of us.
No, I would like to add that it's actually, we think since what's happening in Egypt, realizing we in the West, we live, alhamdulillah, it's freedom, we live better life, yes, this is true, but I've realized after campaigning for Ibrahim, it's actually, things are happening here in Ireland the same, but in Egypt things are more clear and more seen, where here in the West things are under the table, are not very clear. Like, I came across a lot of things which I faced in Ibrahim's campaign, and I realized this is the same. This is there's no longer no one respect human rights. There is no thing such a called humans, respecting humans and human rights organization, and they are no longer independent, especially in the West.